Part 1. The Meadow. The meadow was Hermione's sanctuary. It was a bowl of emerald green cupped by ancient silver-barked aspens, nestled just inside the official territory of the Blackwood Pack, but far enough from their central settlement to be considered wilderness. A tenuous inherited treaty allowed her to live in the small cottage her parents had built, a single human family permitted on the edge of a shifter world as a gesture of goodwill from a long-dead alpha. Her parents were gone now, taken by a human fever years ago, leaving Hermione with the cottage, a small garden, and a library that was her entire world. Her mother, Elise, had been a historian who had spent her career studying shifter cultures from the outside, cataloging their traditions with the reverence of someone who understood she was documenting something extraordinary. Her father, Matthias Voss, had been an archivist who traded favors and coin for every text, every pamphlet, every transcribed oral history he could find. Their library, left to Hermione, was not the casual collection of hobbyists. It was a life's work. She had read every volume by the time she was 16 and started writing corrections in the margins by 17. At 22, she was an anomaly, a ghost haunting the periphery of a society she could observe but never enter. She didn't mind. People were complicated. Books were not. Books laid out their truths on the page, their arguments structured, their narratives contained. The rustle of paper was a far more comforting sound than the ambiguity of conversation. Today's truth was a well-worn copy of The Agricultural Practices of the Pre-Unification Valleys, a title that would have sent most people into a deep slumber. To Hermione, it was fascinating. The author detailed ancient crop rotation methods with a passion she found deeply relatable. She sat with her back against the sun-warmed trunk of a sprawling oak, its leaves dappling the page in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The air was sweet with the scent of clover and wild thyme, and the drone of bees was a gentle counterpoint to the words she murmured aloud. She always read aloud when she was alone, a habit formed in the echoing silence of her cottage after her parents passed. It made the authors feel like companions, their voices joining hers across the centuries. The threefold rotation system, while revolutionary for its time, she read, her voice soft but clear, failed to account for the nitrogen depletion caused by successive plantings of brassicas, a mistake that modern soil analysis of the lowland fields has posthumously confirmed. She paused, smiling faintly, vindicated. She'd always suspected those early farmers were too fond of their turnips. A twig snapped in the woods to her right. A sharp, definitive crack that was not the sound of a squirrel or a bird. Hermione fell silent, her body instantly still. She was not a part of the pack, but she knew its rules, spoken and unspoken. She was permitted, not welcome. Her presence was tolerated as long as she was invisible. A large animal breaking cover this close to her was unusual. The deer were skittish, the bears kept to the high ridges, and the wolves were the pack. They did not hunt this close to the settlement unless commanded, and they certainly didn't make a habit of snapping twigs. They moved like smoke. This was something different. Her heart, a usually placid organ, began a nervous, fluttering rhythm against her ribs. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. The lessons of her father, a cautious man who had studied his powerful neighbors, came back to her. Don't run. Don't show fear. Make yourself small. The rustling grew closer, a heavy, deliberate sound. The undergrowth parted, and a creature of impossible size stepped into the dappled sunlight of the meadow. It was a wolf, but to call it a wolf was like calling a thunderstorm a bit of rain. It was enormous, its shoulders level with her chest even as she sat. Its fur was the color of midnight, a deep, rich black that seemed to drink the light, with tips of silver that glittered like 1,000 tiny stars. Its eyes were the most startling color she had ever seen, a molten gold that burned with a terrifying intelligence. This was no mere animal. This was a shifter. And from its sheer size and the palpable aura of power that rolled off it in waves, he could only be one person. The Alpha King. Aldrich. Hermione's blood ran cold. She had never seen him before, not up close. She had heard the stories, of course, whispers from the 1 or 2 pack members who delivered supplies to her cottage. tales of a king who had united the warring packs of the northern range, a warrior of immense power and a leader burdened by duty. He was a legend. And he was standing 20 feet away from her, his golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Her book lay forgotten in her lap. The words about nitrogen depletion seemed laughably small. She remained utterly still, her hands resting on the open pages, a last point of contact with her familiar world. The great wolf took a step forward, then another. He moved with a liquid grace that was terrifying in a creature so large. There was no aggression in his posture, no bared teeth or menacing growl. There was only a focused, unwavering attention. He was studying her, his head cocked slightly, his ears pricked forward. Hermione forced herself to take a slow, shallow breath, her father's voice again, a calm murmur in the storm of her panic. They can smell fear. Be a stone. Be a tree. She tried to be a tree. She focused on the rough bark of the oak behind her, the solid, unyielding reality of it. The wolf continued its approach, closing the distance until he stood just before her. He was even bigger up close, a mountain of dark fur and muscle. He smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and something else, something wild and electric that made the air itself hum. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. He lowered his massive head, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was going to snap his jaws around her throat, a swift end to the human anomaly in his woods. Instead, his wet, black nose nudged the edge of her book. Hermione blinked. The wolf huffed, a soft puff of warm air that ruffled the pages. He looked from the book to her face, his golden eyes seeming to hold a question. Then, with a deliberation that was almost human, he settled onto the grass beside her. It was a movement of surprising elegance, a folding of long limbs until he was lying down, his body a warm, heavy presence against her leg. He sighed, a sound that rumbled deep in his chest, and laid his great head directly on the open pages of The Agricultural Practices of the Pre-Unification Valleys. Hermione stared. Her heart was still hammering, but the terror was beginning to recede, replaced by a profound and overwhelming sense of absurdity. The Alpha King, a figure of myth and power, was using her agricultural textbook as a pillow. The silence stretched, broken only by the buzzing of bees and the soft sound of the wolf's breathing. Slowly, cautiously, Hermione lifted her hand. It trembled slightly. She hesitated, her fingers hovering in the air above the wolf's head. What was the protocol for this? Was there a protocol for this? Probably not. Her father had never mentioned what to do if a shifter king decided to take a nap on your reading material. Taking another breath, she made a decision. She reached out and gently, tentatively, scratched behind his ear. The fur was thick and surprisingly soft, the ear beneath it velvety and warm. The wolf's ear twitched, and a low sound rumbled from his throat. It wasn't a growl. It was deeper, more resonant. A purr. An enormous, body-shaking purr that vibrated through her fingertips and up her arm. Emboldened, she continued the motion, her fingers finding a rhythm in the dense fur. The great beast's eyes drifted closed, and his head pressed more firmly into the book, a silent request for more. And so Hermione sat, in a sun-drenched meadow on the edge of a kingdom that wasn't hers, scratching the ears of its king. After a moment, the silence felt strange. The story was unfinished, book slightly, trying to read around his book slightly, trying to read around his head. Ah, yes, the brassicas. And she began to read aloud again, her voice growing steady and calm as she returned to the familiar comfort of words. She read about soil acidity and crop yields, about the introduction of the potato and its impact on valley economies. And the whole time, the great black wolf lay beside her, a warm and solid weight, his breathing deep and even, a silent, attentive audience of one. Part 2. The Wolf's Heart. Aldrich's wolf was restless. It had been for weeks. A low, thrumming agitation under his skin that no amount of running, hunting, or pack business could soothe. It was a deep, primal ache, a sense of searching for something he couldn't name. His beta, Marcus, saw it in the way Aldrich paced the strategy room, in the flash of gold in his eyes during council meetings, in the way he would lift his head and scent the wind, as if expecting a message that never came. The pack felt it too, a subtle tension rippling out from their alpha. They were more on edge, their senses sharper, mirroring the unease of their leader. Today, it was unbearable. The endless arguments over trade routes with the Silvercrest pack, the squabbling of elders over ceremonial seating, the sheer weight of the crown he had worn since he was 20, it was all a cage. His wolf clawed at the inside of his mind, desperate for release. Run, the air is stale. The walls are closing in. Run. Without a word to Marcus, who was droning on about lumber tariffs, Aldrich turned and walked from the great hall. He ignored the startled calls of his name. Duty could wait, his soul could not. He strode through the settlement, a village of sturdy timber longhouses nestled in a valley carved by an ancient glacier, and didn't stop until he reached the edge of the forest. There, in the privacy of the towering pines, he let go. The shift was a familiar agony, a fire that burned from the inside out. It was a tearing of skin, a snapping and reforming of bone, a violent surrender of the man to the beast. For an alpha king, the transformation was faster, more brutal than for others. His bones broke and stretched with audible cracks, muscle bunching and reshaping under his skin as it gave way to a thick pelt of midnight fur. His senses exploded. The world, muted and dull in human form, became a symphony of information. He could smell the faintest trace of rabbit from 100 yards away, the sweet decay of a fallen log, the metallic tang of water in the distant river. He could hear the frantic heartbeat of a mouse in its burrow, the whisper of wind through the highest branches of the pines. The man, Aldrich, receded. The wolf took over. And the wolf ran. He didn't run with the pack, he ran alone, a black shadow streaking through the forest, paws silent on the mossy ground. He ran from the weight of his crown, from the expectations of his people, from the suffocating burden of his own power. He ran until his lungs burned and his muscles screamed, but the restlessness remained, a hollow ache in his chest. Then he caught it. A scent on the wind, something new. It wasn't pack, it wasn't animal. It was clean, like fresh rain on summer dust, like honey and chamomile and old paper. It was utterly unique, and it called to a part of him he didn't know existed. His wolf went still. The scent was a thread, and he followed it, his massive paws slowing from a dead run to a cautious, deliberate stalk. It led him away from the deep woods and towards the open land, towards the sun-drenched meadow that bordered the human's territory. The human, the girl, the treaty orphan. He knew of her, of course. A footnote in his pack's history, a lingering obligation from his grandfather's time. She was a non-entity, a harmless whisper on the wind. He had never given her a second thought. But the scent grew stronger, pulling him forward with a force more powerful than gravity. It was a magnetic pull, winding itself around his heart and squeezing. His wolf was no longer restless. It was focused. It was certain. A quiet, joyful hum of recognition that vibrated through every cell of his being. Mate. The word was not a thought. It was a lightning strike, a truth that seared itself onto his soul. It was impossible. She was human, a fragile, soft-skinned creature with none of the strength, the fire, the wildness of his kind. A mate for the Alpha King had to be a she-wolf of a powerful bloodline, someone who could stand beside him, fight beside him, lead the pack into the next generation. A mate was a political alliance, a strengthening of power. A mate was not a wisp of a girl who smelled of flowers and books. And yet, the scent, the pull. He broke through the tree line and saw her. She was sitting under an oak tree, bathed in sunlight, a book in her lap. She was just as the scent had promised, small, delicate, with hair the color of sun-bleached wheat, pulled back from a face that was all quiet concentration. She was reading aloud, her voice a soft melody that wove itself into the fabric of the meadow. His wolf drank in the sight of her, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way a strand of hair escaped and brushed against her cheek, the way her fingers rested on the pages of her book. He took a step forward, and a twig snapped under his paw. A clumsy, foolish sound. Her voice cut off, her body went rigid. He saw the flicker of fear in her wide, hazel eyes, and it was a physical blow. He could smell the spike of adrenaline in her scent, a sharp, bitter note that soured the perfection. He had frightened her. The thought was agony. He had to show her he was no threat. He gentled his posture, lowering his head, softening the lines of his body. He walked forward slowly, deliberately, giving her time to see that he meant no harm. He was a creature of immense power, a killer when he needed to be, but in this moment he felt as clumsy and vulnerable as a newborn pup. He approached until he was right before her. She was so small. His human form towered over most men. His wolf form was a monster of legend. He could have ended her with a single, lazy swipe of his paw. The thought made him sick. He lowered his head, nudging the book she held. It smelled of her unique, intoxicating scent clinging to the worn paper. He wanted to be closer. He needed to be closer, so he did the only thing that felt right. He lay down beside her, a great hulking beast of a wolf, making himself as small and unthreatening as he could. The grass was cool beneath him, but the warmth of her leg against his side was a bonfire. He rested his head on her book, on the very thing that held her attention, a silent plea to be seen, to be part of her world. And then she touched him. Her hand, small and trembling, landed behind his ear. It was a spark, a jolt of pure bliss that shot through his entire body. Every nerve ending came alive. His wolf melted. It purred, a rumbling sound of utter contentment he hadn't made since he was a cub in his mother's den. It was the most undignified sound an alpha king could make, and he didn't care. He closed his eyes, pressing into her touch, surrendering completely to the sensation. And then, her voice. She started reading again. The words themselves were nonsense, something about soil and turnips, but the sound of it washed over him, a soothing balm on his raw, aching soul. He had found it, the thing he had been searching for. It wasn't a place or a victory. It was a person, a small human girl reading a book in a meadow. And his wolf knew, with a certainty that shook the foundations of his world, that everything had changed. Part 3. The Leaving. The moment stretched, suspended in the golden afternoon light. Hermione's voice was a low, steady murmur, a stark contrast to the frantic drumming in her own ears. She read 3 more pages about crop rotation, her mind only partially on the text. The other part, the larger, screaming part, was hyper-aware of the mountain of warm, breathing wolf pressed against her side. His purr had subsided into a deep, even breathing that suggested sleep. The sheer trust of it was more disarming than any show of aggression would have been. Wild animals didn't sleep in the open next to a potential threat. And alpha kings, she presumed, did not take naps with treaty orphans. The situation was so far outside the bounds of her experience that her brain, which thrived on categorization and logic, had simply short-circuited. It filed the experience under to be analyzed later, possibly never. So she focused on the tangible, the weight of his head on the book, the faint, earthy scent of his fur, the rhythmic rise and fall of his flank against her leg, and the words on the page. Words were safe. She kept reading until the sun began to dip below the tree line, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. The light on the page faded, and her voice finally faltered. The great wolf stirred. He lifted his head, the book falling into her lap with a soft thud. He blinked his molten gold eyes, which seemed to capture the last rays of the setting sun. He looked at her, and the intelligence in that gaze was sharp and unnervingly human. He yawned, a cavernous opening of a mouth filled with teeth that could sever a limb. Then he rose to his feet and stood before her, and something shifted. He went still, his golden eyes locked on hers. The playful warmth from before was gone. In its place was something raw and open and almost unbearably tender. The air between them seemed to thicken. Slowly, he lowered his great head. Hermione held her breath. His forehead pressed against hers, gentle and deliberate. His fur was warm against her skin, his breath soft on her face. She could feel the vibration of a low sound deep in his chest, not quite a purr, something quieter, something that sounded like reverence. He held there for 3 heartbeats, 4, 5. Then he pulled back. He looked at her one last time, a look that felt like a promise, though of what she couldn't possibly imagine, and turned. He trotted back into the woods, disappearing into the deepening shadows, as if he had been nothing more than a dream. Hermione sat frozen for a long time. Her forehead tingled where his had pressed against it. She raised her hand and touched the spot, her fingers trembling. The warmth lingered, and beneath it, something else. A strange aching pull, as if an invisible thread had been attached to her ribs and was now being drawn taut towards the darkening woods. She didn't understand it. She didn't like not understanding things. She looked down at the book in her lap. There, on page 114, was a faint, damp spot and a single, coarse, black hair. It wasn't a dream. She packed her book into her canvas satchel, her movements stiff and automatic. The walk back to her cottage, usually a familiar, comforting routine, felt different. The woods seemed more alive, the shadows deeper. She was acutely aware of being watched, though she knew it was likely her imagination. When she reached the safety of her small stone cottage, she locked the door, something she hadn't done in years, and leaned against it, her heart still beating a frantic, unsteady rhythm. She pressed her back against the solid wood and closed her eyes. She was a rational person. She cataloged facts. She analyzed data. She did not stand in dark cottages with her hand on her forehead, trying to hold on to the warmth of an animal that was not an animal. And yet, she opened her eyes, went to her desk, pulled out her journal, and wrote, Day 1. Anomalous encounter with Alpha King, wolf form. Duration, approximately 4 hours. Behavior, non-aggressive, tactile, responsive to vocalization. Departed at dusk. Unexplained physiological response in subject, me. Elevated heart rate, persistent epidermal warmth at point of contact, irrational desire to follow. Requires further observation. She stared at the last 3 words for a long time. Then she underlined them twice and went to bed, where she did not sleep. Part 4. The Man. Aldrich returned to the pack settlement long after nightfall, slipping back into his human form in the shadows of the armory. The shift back was less painful, softened by the lingering contentment that suffused him. He felt calm. The restlessness was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant certainty. He dressed in the spare clothes he kept there and walked towards the great hall, his mind replaying every second in the meadow. The scent of her, the feel of her hand in his fur, the sound of her voice. The moment he had pressed his forehead to hers and felt something inside him lock into place with an audible click, like the final tumbler of a lock he hadn't known was waiting to be opened. His wolf was a quiet, satisfied presence in his mind. It had chosen. The matter was settled. Now came the hard part. Aldrich, the man, the king, had to deal with the consequences of his wolf's heart. He walked into the great hall to find Marcus pacing, his face a mask of worry. Aldrich, where have you been? The council is furious. The Silvercrest envoy thinks you've snubbed them. Marcus, Aldrich said, his voice quiet but carrying the full weight of his alpha authority. Marcus fell silent instantly. Aldrich walked to the high table and poured himself a goblet of water. His hand was perfectly steady. Cancel my meetings for tomorrow morning. But Alpha, the trade agreement. Reschedule them, Aldrich commanded, his gaze distant. He could still smell her on his skin, faint traces of chamomile and old paper under the scent of pine and wolf. I have a more pressing matter to attend to. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, saw the look in his Alpha's eyes, and wisely shut it. He had never seen Aldrich like this. The usual weight of the world seemed to have lifted from his shoulders, replaced by something else, something fierce and focused and deeply personal. The next day, Aldrich did not go to the meadow as a wolf. He went as a man. He dressed not in his formal alpha attire, but in simple, practical leather trousers and a linen tunic. He needed her to see him, not the king. He found her in the same spot, under the same oak tree, another book open in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her body tensing. He saw the recognition in her eyes, and something else, wariness. He couldn't blame her. "Good morning," he said, his voice feeling too loud in the peaceful quiet of the meadow. He stopped a respectful 10 feet away. Hermione just stared, her hazel eyes wide. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her book. "You're the wolf," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I am," he confirmed. "My name is Aldrich." "I know who you are," she said, and her voice was a little stronger now, a hint of steel beneath the softness. "You're the Alpha King." "I am that too." He took another slow step forward. "May I ask your name?" Hermione Voss." The name suited her, precise, a little old-fashioned, with hidden depths. "Hermione," he repeated, testing the sound of it. It felt right. "I apologize if I startled you yesterday. My wolf was not entirely under my control." This was an understatement. His wolf was never out of control, but yesterday it had been following an instinct older and more powerful than any conscious command. Hermione watched him, her expression unreadable. She was a fortress, her walls built of quiet observation. "You used my book as a pillow." The corner of Aldrich's mouth twitched. He had faced down rogue alphas and negotiated with ancient, cunning shifters. But this small human girl with her blunt honesty was completely disarming. "It was a very comfortable book," he said, his voice laced with a humor he rarely showed. The part about nitrogen depletion was particularly restful. A flicker of something, surprise, amusement, crossed her face before she shuddered it away. He was tall. She noticed this with the detached objectivity of someone measuring a bookshelf to see if it would fit against a wall. Unreasonably, unnecessarily tall, with a jaw that looked like it had been designed to illustrate a chapter on bone structure. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that had no business being distracting and was, nevertheless, distracting. She noted this, academically. "What do you want, Your Majesty?" she asked, her tone formal, a shield. The question was direct, and it cut through all the pretense. What did he want? He wanted to sit with her in the sun. He wanted to hear her read about turnips. He wanted to tell her that something in him had recognized something in her, and the world had not been the same since. But he couldn't say any of that. Not yet. So he chose a different truth. "My pack has one of the oldest archives in the Northern Range," he began, his voice even. "Hundreds of years of history, treaties, and records. But our historian is old, her eyes are failing. The collection is disorganized. Many of the older texts are fragile. It requires a delicate hand and a keen eye." He watched her face. Her grip on her book had loosened slightly. Her head was tilted, a spark of genuine interest in her eyes. He had her. "I came to offer you a position," he said, laying his trap. "As the royal archivist and librarian for the Blackwood Pack. You would have unlimited access to the entire collection, your own quarters within the main settlement." He paused, and something in his tone shifted, the warmth cooling into steel. "You would be under my personal protection. The treaty that permits your presence here was my grandfather's promise, not mine. There are those in my council who have questioned its continuation. Your cottage sits on land that borders 3 patrol routes. Sooner or later, someone would have raised the issue formally." Hermione's stomach tightened. She had known, in the abstract, that her position was precarious. Hearing it stated so plainly was different. "You're saying I would have been evicted?" "I'm saying the question would have been asked, And I would rather you be somewhere the answer doesn't matter. She stared at him, her mind racing. The archives. Hundreds of years of history. Primary source documents. Treaties. Her fingers literally twitched with the urge to hold a 1,000-year-old scroll. It was the most tempting offer anyone could have possibly made her. It was a dragon offering its entire hoard. But there was the rest of it. The danger he had just laid bare. The implication that her quiet life on the edge of his territory had been borrowed time all along. Why, she asked, her gaze sharp and analytical. Why me? I'm human. I'm an outsider. Aldrich met her gaze without flinching. Because my wolf likes the way you read. It was the truest thing he could say, and the most ridiculous. But as he looked at her, he saw a slow, hesitant smile finally break through her composure, and it was like watching the sunrise. She had dimples. He hadn't been prepared for dimples. He forgot, briefly, how to breathe. Part 5. The Archives. The decision was, in the end, an easy one. She agreed, with a prim and proper nod. That Aldrich found utterly enchanting. She packed her life into 3 wooden crates, 2 for her most treasured books, including her parents' entire annotated collection, and 1 for her meager collection of clothes, her gardening tools, and a framed photograph of her parents. The journey from her quiet cottage to the bustling heart of the Blackwood Pack settlement was a jarring transition. The longhouses were enormous, built from whole timbers that spoke of the shifter's incredible strength. The air, which in her meadow had smelled of clover and thyme, was now thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and hundreds of living bodies. It was overwhelming, a sensory assault. People, shifters, were everywhere. Large, boisterous men and women with an easy confidence and physicality that made Hermione feel like a fragile piece of glass. They moved with purpose, their laughter loud, their arguments louder. They stared at her as Aldrich himself escorted her through the main square, their alpha king walking beside a slip of a human girl. Whispers followed them like the rustling of leaves. Aldrich ignored them, his presence a solid, unyielding wall of authority that parted the crowds. He led her to a set of rooms adjoining the great hall, more spacious and well-appointed than any place she had ever lived. There was a soft bed with a thick fur blanket, a small hearth already laid with wood, and, most importantly, a heavy oak door that led directly into the archives. Aldrich opened it for her. The scent that wafted out was the most beautiful perfume Hermione had ever smelled. The dry, dusty, vanilla-like fragrance of old paper and leather. The room was vast, circular, with shelves that reached from floor to ceiling, crammed with scrolls, leather-bound tomes, and stacks of loose parchment. A ladder on a rolling track promised access to the highest shelves. Sunlight streamed through a high, round window in the ceiling, illuminating dancing dust motes. It was a cathedral of knowledge. "Is it satisfactory?" Aldrich asked, a hint of apprehension in his voice. Hermione didn't answer. She took a tentative step inside, then another, her eyes wide with a reverence she usually reserved for first editions. She ran a finger along the spine of a massive iron-clasped book. "This is a record of the pack census from the 3rd Alpha, isn't it?" she breathed, not looking at him. Aldrich blinked, surprised. "Yes, how did you know?" "The binding style," she said, her voice distant, already lost. "My mother documented this technique in her 4th monograph. It's specific to that period. The use of iron clasps was discontinued under Alpha Ronan IV due to resource shortages during the long winter. They switched to leather ties, which..." She trailed off, her attention caught by a stack of scrolls. "Are these the original territorial pacts with the mountain clans?" She was gone. She had crossed a threshold into her own personal heaven, and he had ceased to exist. A slow smile spread across Aldrich's face. His wolf hummed with quiet contentment. "I will leave you to get acquainted," he said softly. "Alara, our current historian, will meet you in the morning. Be gentle with her. She considers these books her children." Hermione gave a vague, distracted nod, her focus already consumed by a hand-drawn map that was peeling at the edges. Aldrich watched her for a moment longer, this strange, brilliant creature who had wandered into his life and turned it upside down. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it almost buckled his knees. He would let no harm come to her. He would give her the world, or, in this case, a dusty room full of old books. He closed the door quietly, leaving her to her new kingdom. Part 6. The Settling In. Hermione worked for the next week in a state of blissful hyper-focus. She rose with the sun, ate the meals that were left silently outside her door, and worked until her eyes burned and her fingers were smudged with ink and dust. The archive was a glorious, chaotic mess. Elara, the old historian, was a sweet, forgetful woman with a passion for oral history, but a complete disdain for organization. Scrolls were mislabeled, books were shelved out of chronological order, and fragile documents were stacked haphazardly. It was a disaster. It was perfect. Hermione began by creating a system. She acquired parchment and ink and began to build a master catalog. She took notes, copious notes. She filled page after page with observations, questions, and cross-references. Her little room became a command center, its walls slowly being covered with sheets of parchment detailing bloodlines, treaty timelines, and agricultural output charts. The pack, meanwhile, was baffled by her. They would see her flitting across the main square, a stack of books in her arms, her brow furrowed in thought. She would eat her meals alone in a corner of the great hall, her nose buried in a scroll, oblivious to the stairs. She was a ghost in their midst, a quiet academic in a world of warriors. Aldrich found himself making excuses to visit the archives. He would bring her a cup of tea, or ask a manufactured question about a treaty, just to watch her. He loved the way she would look up, her eyes unfocused for a moment, as they returned from whatever century she had been visiting, and then sharpen with startling intelligence as she processed his question. She never gave a simple answer. A question about a single trade route would lead to a 20-minute lecture on the socio-economic impact of river-based commerce in the early dynasties, complete with references to 3 different scrolls and a map she had corrected herself. It was bewildering. It was magnificent. What he couldn't know, what she would never have told him, was that she always heard him coming. His footsteps were distinctive, heavier than anyone else's, with a particular cadence that she had involuntarily memorized. And each time she heard that rhythm approaching, something fluttered in her chest, a quick, bright sensation she refused to name. She would busy herself with whatever was nearest, so that when he opened the door, she could look up with an expression of mild surprise, as if she hadn't been listening for him for the last 10 minutes. It was deeply unscientific, this flutter. She resented it. She resented it more when he leaned over her shoulder to look at a map and she caught his scent, pine and wood smoke, and something warm underneath. And her hand trembled so badly she dropped her charcoal. She blamed it on the draft from the window. There was no draft from the window. Part 7. The Cloak. It was late on the 5th night when Aldrich found himself walking the corridors, unable to sleep. His wolf was restless again, but not in the aimless, searching way of before. This restlessness had a direction. It pulled him, as it always did now, towards the archives. The door was slightly ajar. A thin line of amber light spilled into the hallway. He pushed it open, guttering. Ink stained her fingers, and guttering. Ink stained her fingers, and there was a smudge of charcoal on her nose. Her hair had come loose from its tie and lay in messy, wheat-colored waves across the parchment she had been working on. Aldrich stood in the doorway and did not move. She was so still. The sharp, brilliant mind that never stopped turning was, for once, at rest. She looked younger like this, softer. The fortress was down. The analytical gaze that could flay a man's argument to the bone was hidden behind closed lids. She looked small. Something tightened in his chest, a feeling so large and so tender it almost hurt. He crossed the room silently and took the thick cloak from his own shoulders. It was heavy, lined with dark wolf fur, and carried his scent. He draped it carefully over her, tucking it around her narrow shoulders with hands that could snap a man's neck, but now moved with the delicacy of someone handling a first edition. She stirred slightly, her fingers curling into the fur, and she made a small, unconscious sound, a sigh that was almost a hum. She nestled deeper into the cloak, her brow smoothing. Aldrich stood there, looking at her. His hand reached out. His fingers hovered above her cheek, close enough to feel the warmth of her skin. He pulled his hand back. He stood a moment longer, watching the candlelight play across her face, and then he left, closing the door behind him without a sound. Hermione woke before dawn, disoriented. Her neck ached. Her face was creased with the imprint of a bookbinding, and she was warm, impossibly warm, wrapped in something heavy and soft that smelled of... She went very still. Pine. Wood smoke. And underneath, that other scent? The one she couldn't name, the one that made her pulse do something embarrassing and unscientific. She pulled the cloak closer without thinking, burying her face in the dark fur. She breathed in, deeply, and something inside her that had been wound tight for years loosened, just a fraction. She sat with it for a long time, in the gray pre-dawn light of the archives, wrapped in the Alpha King's cloak. Then she folded it carefully, precisely, corner to corner, the way she folded her most important documents. She placed it on the chair outside the archive door. She did not leave a note. At breakfast, she saw him across the great hall. He was wearing the cloak. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, no more, and something passed between them that neither of them acknowledged. Hermione looked down at her porridge and stirred it with great concentration. The porridge did not require stirring. Neither of them mentioned the cloak. It sat between them, like a word neither of them knew how to say. Part 8. The Blood Moon. The first real test of her integration came during the week of the Blood Moon, a sacred time for the pack. It was a week of rituals, feasts, and ceremonies, honoring their connection to the moon goddess and the spirit of the wolf. It was a time of deep, instinctual tradition. To Hermione, it was a fascinating anthropological event. She attended the opening ceremony in the sacred circle, a clearing in the woods ringed by ancient standing stones. While the pack members closed their eyes, swaying to the low, guttural chanting of the elders, Hermione stood slightly to the side, a small notebook and a piece of charcoal in her hand. She was taking notes. She sketched the patterns on the stones, noted the harmonic structure of the chants, and jotted down questions. Query, she muttered to herself. Is the four-part harmony a recent development or an original feature? Compare with Silvercrest Pack's three-part lament. Possible cultural cross-pollination post-unification? A young she-wolf standing nearby shot her a scandalized look. Hermione didn't notice. She was in her element. Later, at the ceremonial feast, Aldrich watched with a mixture of horror and adoration as she cornered one of the oldest and most revered elders, a grizzled warrior named Kale. Kale was telling a group of young pups the foundational myth of the pack, the story of how the first alpha was a man who fell in love with the moon and was gifted the form of a wolf so he could run with her light. It was a sacred story, told 1,000 times. Kale was halfway through, his voice booming with practiced gravitas, and the moon goddess, in her infinite wisdom, saw the love in his heart and said, I will give you a gift. You will wear the cloak of the night and have the speed of the wind. Excuse me, a clear voice cut through the rapt silence. It was Hermione. She had a half-eaten bread roll in one hand and her notebook in the other. Places this event during the Age of Stars. Places this event during the Age of Stars. But the geological records I've been reviewing from the archive suggest this valley was underwater until the Great Thaw, which is at least 2,000 years later. Furthermore, the concept of a singular moon goddess doesn't appear in any written records until the codification of faith under Alpha Lyra, who was notoriously fond of centralizing spiritual authority. Earlier sources refer to a pantheon of celestial spirits. So, was the first Alpha a swimmer? Or is the goddess reference an anachronistic embellishment? The silence that fell over the great hall was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the stone floor. Kale's jaw worked, but no sound came out. The pups stared, their eyes wide. Everyone was looking at Hermione, who stood there expectantly, charcoal poised over her notebook, genuinely waiting for an answer. Aldrich put his head in his hands and fought the urge to either laugh until he cried or drag her out of the hall. This was a disaster. A beautiful, brilliant, glorious disaster. He stood up, the scrape of his chair loud in the silence. All eyes snapped to him. "Hermione is our new royal archivist," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "She is tasked with preserving our history. Her questions are not meant to disrespect, but to clarify, to ensure the truth of our past is recorded accurately for all future generations." He walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "She is under my protection. Her work is vital to this pack." He looked down at Cale, whose face was a mixture of outrage and confusion. "An excellent point, Archivist," Aldrich said to Hermione, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "Cale, perhaps you and Hermione could meet tomorrow to discuss the primary sources. I'm sure you would both find it illuminating." Hermione beamed, oblivious to the social carnage she had just caused. "Wonderful! I have a list of 47 other chronological inconsistencies I'd like to address." Aldrich squeezed her shoulder, a silent plea for mercy, and steered her back towards her seat. As they walked, he leaned in close. "My brave, foolish archivist," he murmured. "One day you will be the death of me." His breath was warm against her ear, and she felt goosebumps erupt down the left side of her body, which was both involuntary and deeply inconvenient. "Death is a fascinating biological and social phenomenon," she said, her voice slightly higher than usual. "The pack's funerary rites are quite inconsistent with those of other wolf clans in the region. I have a theory about that." She was talking faster. She knew she was talking faster. It was what she did when her body started doing things her mind hadn't authorized. She buried the sensation under an avalanche of words, as if enough sentences could smother whatever was happening in the vicinity of her ribcage. Aldrich sighed. He had no idea that a man sighing could sound like that, warm and deep and slightly rough, like a sound that had weight. She made a mental note to never stand this close to him again. She broke the note within the hour. Part 9. The Great Council. The diplomatic fallout from Hermione's historical fact-checking of the pack's most sacred myth was, mercifully, contained. Cale, after a sputtering, grumpy start, found himself cornered by her relentless logic and surprisingly detailed knowledge. Their scheduled meeting turned into a week-long series of debates that left the old warrior exhausted but, to everyone's surprise, grudgingly impressed. He started referring to her as the little razor mind, and was overheard telling other elders that she had a good nose for truth, even if she has no respect. It was the highest praise he was capable of giving. Hermione, for her part, had meticulously documented their entire foundational myth, complete with footnotes, appendices, and a lengthy essay on the evolution of deistic representation in pre-literate shifter societies. Aldrich now had a 50-page, academically rigorous treatise on a story that used to take 5 minutes to tell around a campfire. He cherished it. But her next intellectual adventure would not be so easily contained within the pack. The time came for the annual Great Council, a gathering of the alphas from all the allied packs in the Northern Range. It was a crucial event for reaffirming alliances, settling disputes, and demonstrating the strength and unity of the region under Aldrich's kingship. Delegations arrived over several days, filling the Blackwood settlement with a kaleidoscope of different scents, colors, and traditions. The air crackled with power and politics. Hermione was, predictably, in heaven. New people meant new data. She haunted the edges of the welcoming ceremonies, her notebook a constant companion, documenting variations in greeting rituals and honorifics. Aldrich had given her a simple, explicit instruction. "Please, Hermione, for my sake, just listen. Don't talk." She had agreed, with an earnest nod that he knew meant she would try, right up until the moment her curiosity overwhelmed her. The main event was a grand feast in the Great Hall. The long tables were laden with roasted boar, venison, and all manner of harvest vegetables. The room was packed with the most powerful shifters on the continent, alphas, betas, and their entourages, all jostling for position and influence. Aldrich sat at the head table, a king in his element, projecting an aura of calm, unshakable authority. Hermione was seated at a less prominent table, between a quiet, matronly beta from the Stone River pack and a young, eager warrior from Aldrich's own guard, who had been tasked with keeping her refilled with water and out of trouble. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. Hermione was mostly quiet, observing the complex social dynamics with the focus of a field naturalist watching a rare species. Then, the storytelling began. It was tradition for the visiting alphas to boast of their pack's history and strength, often by recounting their founding legends. The first to speak was Alpha Bourne of the Iron Ridge Pack, a massive bear-like man with a booming voice and a beard braided with iron rings. "My ancestor, the great Torvin Ironhand, carved our territory from the mountains themselves," he roared, slamming a fist on the table for emphasis. "He wrestled a great cave bear for 3 days and 3 nights, and when he emerged victorious, its spirit became one with his, giving us the strength of the mountain." There were appreciative growls and cheers from the hall. Hermione, however, was frowning. She leaned over to the young guard. "Cave bears have been extinct in this region for 10,000 years, according to the fossil record," she whispered. "The timeline is problematic." The guard choked on his ale. The second alpha to speak was Cora of the Whispering Pines Pack, a lean, sharp-faced woman whose people were known for their speed and stealth. "Our first mother, Lyra Swiftfoot, was so fast she could outrun the wind," she said, her voice like the rustle of leaves. "It is said she raced a bolt of lightning down from the sky peak and won, capturing its spark to light the first fire of our people." More cheers. Hermione scribbled furiously in her notebook. "Fascinating," she murmured. "A classic Taming of the Elements motif. But the average lightning bolt travels at 270,000 miles per hour. Even accounting for poetic license, the claim is empirically unsound. Also, the earliest evidence of controlled fire in this region predates the estimated formation of the Whispering Pines clan by at least 5 centuries. It's more likely they learned the skill through trade with the valley dwellers." The guard beside her looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. He subtly tried to push the platter of bread rolls closer to her, as if hoping to distract her with carbohydrates. It was a futile effort. The final speaker was Alpha Gunner of the Frostfang Pack, a pale, cold-eyed man from the far north, whose pack was notoriously proud and touchy. His legend was the most dramatic. "The first Frostfang Alpha did not come from this world," Gunner proclaimed, his voice chilling the room. "He fell from the sky on a star of burning ice. He was a god amongst wolves, and his blood, the blood of the sky, flows in our veins. That is why we alone can withstand the heart of the deepest winter." A hush of awe fell over the hall. Hermione, however, had reached her limit. The sheer volume of historical inaccuracy and scientific impossibility was too much to bear. She stood up. The young guard made a desperate grab for her sleeve, but it was too late. "Excuse me," she said, her clear voice cutting through the silence. Every head in the hall turned towards her. Aldrich, at the head table, felt a familiar sensation of impending doom. He closed his eyes for a brief second. "Alpha Gunner," Hermione began, her tone that of a patient teacher correcting a promising but misguided student. "Your pack's founding myth is compelling from a narrative standpoint, but it presents several critical issues." Gunner stared at her, his pale eyes narrowing into slits. "Who is this human?" he hissed. "I find the Star of Burning Ice concept particularly intriguing," Hermione continued, undeterred. "It's likely a cultural memory of a meteor impact. Based on the crater formations in your territory, I would hypothesize a nickel-iron meteorite, not a theoretical ice one, which would have sublimated on entry. As for the claim of celestial blood, a genetic analysis would be required to verify, but given the shared physiological traits with all other Canis lupus shifter variants, I suspect we would find your DNA to be disappointingly terrestrial. Your pack's remarkable cold tolerance is more plausibly explained by generations of adaptation and a high-fat diet, which is well documented in the trade manifests I've reviewed from the last 200 years. You don't have star blood, you have excellent blubber." The silence in the hall was no longer awed, it was horrified. Alpha Boren's face was purple. Alpha Cora looked like she had swallowed a wasp, and Alpha Gunner looked like he was about to shift and rip out the throat of the small human who had just reduced his divine ancestry to body fat. The young guard beside Hermione had gone pale and seemed to be trying to merge with the table. Aldrich moved. He didn't run. He simply flowed from his seat, covering the distance to Hermione's side in 3 long, silent strides. He placed a heavy, possessive hand on her shoulder, his golden eyes sweeping the room, challenging anyone to move, to speak. "My archivist is passionate," Aldrich said, his voice a low, rumbling growl that was pure Alpha King. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact and a warning. He looked down at Hermione, whose face was alight with the thrill of intellectual debate, completely oblivious to the fact that she was seconds away from starting an interpack war. "She finds truth beautiful," he continued, his voice softening slightly as he looked at her. He then turned his gaze back to the 3 stunned alphas. His eyes hardened. "She has done you a service. A legend that cannot withstand scrutiny is a weakness, not a strength. It is a crack in the foundation of your house." He looked at Boren. "Your strength is not from a mythical bear, Boren. It is in the iron of your will and the loyalty of your people. That is real. That is worth boasting about." He turned to Cora. "Your people's speed is not from a forgotten race. It is earned, through generations of training and discipline. That is far more impressive than magic." Finally, he faced Gunnar, his gaze steady and unyielding. "And your people, Gunnar, did not fall from the sky. They rose from the snow. They survived and thrived in a land that would kill lesser wolves. They are not gods. They are survivors. And that is the greatest honor of all." He let his words hang in the air. He had taken Hermione's disastrous, clinical deconstruction and spun it into a tribute to their true strength. It was a masterful display of political jujitsu. He had defended his mate, placated his allies, and reinforced his own authority, all in one breath. The tension in the room began to ease. Boren grunted, looking thoughtful. Cora gave a slow, respectful nod. Gunnar said nothing. His pale eyes moved from Aldrich to the small human woman at his side, and something cold and calculating settled behind them. He raised his goblet in a toast that didn't reach his eyes, drank deeply, and smiled. It was the kind of smile that had edges. Aldrich turned his attention back to Hermione. He leaned in close, his voice a private murmur for her ears alone. "We are going to have a long talk about the definition of poetic license," he growled softly. Hermione looked up at him, a tiny frown on her face. "But from a scholarly perspective, accuracy is paramount. A foundation built on falsehoods is no foundation at all. It's just pretty sand." Aldrich straightened up, his hand still firmly on her shoulder, a silent declaration to the entire room. She was his. Her brilliant, infuriating, disastrous mind was his. And he would stand between her and the world for as long as he had to. Later that evening, as the hall emptied, Aldrich caught Marcus watching the Frostfang delegation's departure from a window. "Problem?" Aldrich asked. Marcus didn't turn around. "Gunnar's second spoke to 3 of our border scouts tonight. Casual conversation, very friendly. Very specific questions about the eastern passes." A pause. "And about the human girl." Aldrich's jaw tightened. "Double the watch on the eastern border, and assign a personal guard to Hermione's quarters. A quiet one. She doesn't need to know." Marcus nodded. "She'll notice." "She'll notice," Aldrich agreed grimly. "And then she'll write a report about it." Part 10. The Rest of the Council. The rest of the Great Council passed in a blur of tense diplomacy. Aldrich spent most of it smoothing the ruffled fur of the 3 alphas, a task made more difficult by the fact that Hermione kept trying to help by providing them with meticulously researched folders of data to support her points. He eventually had to confiscate her charcoal and parchment and assign 2 of his largest, most stoic guards to flank her at all times with the single instruction: distract her with food. It worked, to a degree. Hermione found the culinary variations between the packs to be a fertile new field of inquiry, and spent a happy afternoon documenting the flakiness of the Stone River Pack's pastries versus the density of the Iron Ridge's hardtack. Aldrich made a mental note to thank his cook. Part 11. The Archive. When the last of the delegations had finally departed, a collective sigh of relief went through the Blackwood settlement. Aldrich felt as though he had personally wrestled 3 cave bears, outrun a lightning bolt, and fallen from a star. He was exhausted. He found Hermione where he knew she would be, back in her sanctuary, the archives. She was perched on the rolling ladder near the ceiling, examining a scroll with a small magnifying glass. The late afternoon sun streamed through the high window, illuminating her in a halo of golden light and dancing dust motes. She looked ethereal, a scholar saint in her dusty cathedral. He didn't announce himself, just leaned against the doorframe and watched her. The silence in the room was a balm to his frayed nerves. Here, there were no politics, no posturing alphas, just the quiet rustle of parchment and the intense focus of the woman who had captured his soul. She was humming to herself, a tuneless little melody, as she made a note on a small tablet resting in her lap. He saw that she had somehow acquired a new piece of charcoal. He would have to have a word with his guards. After a few minutes, she seemed to feel his presence. She looked down, her eyes, magnified slightly by the lens she held, blinking at him. "Oh, Aldrich, hello." "Hermione," he said, his voice warm. "Hiding from your diplomatic triumphs?" She wrinkled her nose. "They were being illogical. It's very vexing." She carefully rolled up the scroll and placed it back in its cylindrical container. "I don't understand why people prefer a flattering lie to a useful truth." "Because the lie makes them feel strong," he said, walking further into the room. "The truth sometimes makes them feel small." "That seems counterproductive," she said, starting to climb down the ladder. "How can you build anything on a weak foundation?" She was halfway down when her foot slipped on a rung. She gave a small cry of surprise as she lost her balance. Aldrich moved in a blur, his shifter reflexes taking over. He caught her easily, scooping her out of the air and holding her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. Her magnifying glass and charcoal tablet clattered to the floor. Neither of them moved. Her arms had gone around his neck on instinct. Her face was inches from his, close enough that she could see the ring of darker amber around the gold of his eyes, a detail she had somehow never noticed, though she had been cataloging details about him for weeks now in a section of her journal she refused to label. He was holding her as if she were something precious, something breakable. His hands on her waist were large and warm and impossibly gentle, and she could feel the tension in them, the restraint of someone who was being very, very careful. She could feel his heartbeat. It was fast as hers. This was a data point she had not expected. The Alpha King, the most powerful shifter in the Northern Range, whose resting heart rate she had estimated at approximately 50 beats per minute based on his general physiology and size, was holding her, and his heart was racing. Because of her. The realization landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through every careful assumption she had built. "You should be more careful," he murmured. His voice was lower than usual, rougher. He hadn't put her down. His arms had tightened around her, a fraction, and she didn't think he was aware of it. "The rungs are uneven," she said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, breathless and thin. "A clear violation of basic safety standards. I should draft a report." She was talking. Good. Talking was safe. Talking was what she did when her body started doing unauthorized things, like noticing the way his thumb was drawing a slow, absent circle against her hip, or the way his breath stirred the hair at her temple, or the way his scent, pine, wood smoke, and that other thing, the thing that had lived in his cloak, was filling her lungs and making it very difficult to remember what she had been saying. "Please don't," he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted, just barely. She stared at that mouth. She had never stared at a mouth before. She had never had cause to. Mouths were functional structures involved in speech and mastication, and they were not, as a rule, interesting. This one was interesting. She jerked her gaze back to his eyes, which was worse because he had seen her look, and there was something in his expression now that was quiet and warm and absolutely devastating. He was looking at her the way she looked at a first edition, as if she were the only copy in the world, and he couldn't quite believe he was allowed to hold her. Something inside her cracked, a tiny fissure in the fortress she had built around herself, and through it flooded a feeling so large and so terrifying that her analytical mind went completely, catastrophically blank. She did the only thing she could think of. She reached for the nearest safe topic, like a drowning person reaching for a rope. "Your historian, Ilara," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She made a critical error in her transcription of the third treaty with the Silvercrest Pack. Aldrich blinked. "The treaty," Hermione repeated, her voice gaining strength as she retreated into the familiar architecture of facts. "The one that cedes the mineral rights to the eastern slopes." Ilara transcribed the word vobis as nobis, to you instead of to us. A simple but catastrophic mistake. She's given away the richest silver deposits in the territory for 100 years, all because of a misplaced vowel. She was talking faster now, her eyes brightening with the safety of intellectual discovery, even as her arms were still around his neck, and his hands were still on her waist, and neither of them had acknowledged that he still had not put her down. Aldrich stared at her. And then he started to laugh. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a deep, booming, heartfelt laugh that filled the entire archive. He laughed until tears pricked his eyes. He laughed at the absurdity, at the perfection of it. He was having a soul-shaking moment, and she was worried about a treaty from 100 years ago. He buried his face in her hair, his laughter shaking both of them. Her arms tightened around his neck, not letting go, and she felt the laugh move through his whole body and into hers. And despite everything, despite the terror and the confusion and the unnamed thing cracking open inside her chest, she smiled. It was a small, private smile, pressed against his shoulder where he couldn't see it. "Oh, Hermione," he sighed, his voice thick with something she couldn't identify. "Never change." He set her down gently, though his hands lingered on her waist for a moment longer than necessary. His thumbs brushed against her hips, once a feather-light touch, and then he let go. The absence of his hands felt like a loss of data. "Show me," he said. And as she led him over to a long table, her face alight with passion as she unrolled a massive, ancient piece of parchment and began to point out the faded ink, Aldrich watched her and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had been wrong. This wasn't a distraction from the moment. This was the moment. This was love. Watching her argue with a long-dead scribe over a misplaced vowel, watching her mind, so bright and fierce, set right the history of his world. She was not just his mate. She was his partner, his equal, the razor-sharp edge his kingdom had been missing. She finished her explanation, her finger tracing the offending word. "You see, it changes everything." She looked up at him then, her academic fervor fading as she once again caught the look on his face. He was staring. Not at the treaty, at her. The laughter was gone, replaced by that same raw, breathtaking intensity from before. Only now it was magnified, amplified by something deeper. Something that had been building since a sun-drenched meadow and a book about turnips. The air grew thick again. The dust motes seemed to hang suspended in the golden light. He didn't look away. And this time, neither did she. The fortress had a crack in it now, and through it, something warm was pouring in. Something that smelled of pine and wood smoke and felt like coming home to a place she had never been. Hermione Voss, who had spent her entire life finding safety in the written word, stood in a golden archive with ink on her fingers and a crack in her walls. And for the first time in her life, did not reach for a book. She reached for nothing at all. She simply stood and let herself be seen. It was the bravest thing she had ever done.